Welcome, everyone, to the Alum Fellows reading series at the Hutchins Center here at Harvard. We are delighted that Alum Fellow Sarah Nuttall is here to speak on hydrocolonialism and pluviality, reading for rain in the African South. She is research professor in literary and cultural studies at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research, WISER, at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. From 2012 to 2022, she was director of the Institute, one of the largest and most established across the global South. The author and editor of numerous significant and highly acclaimed books, her work is cited widely across many disciplines. Recently, she has engaged in collaborative and public humanities projects at WISER on reading for water in the archives of Southern African literature and cultures and on exploring materiality as method. One of several works published in 2023 is Reading from the South, African Print Cultures and Oceanic Terns in the work of Isabella Hofmeyr, and her latest monograph on pluviality is forthcoming. We are also very honored that Yvette Christianse is serving as our discussant. She is Claire Tao Professor of Africana Studies and English Literature at Barnard College. Her critical, archival, and literary work, both poetic and novelistic, intersect in the vicinities of African diasporic subjectivities with emphasis on the long maritime histories of combating slavery in the Indian and Atlantic Oceans, as well as in the Mediterranean and Caribbean seas. Her major publications include Toni Morrison and Ethical Poetics, the novel Unconfessed, the poetry collection Castaway, and the poetry collection Imprendora. With Rosalind C. Morris, she is the librettist and producer of Southern Crossings, a chamber opera with composer Saeed Jabri. Thank you both for participating, and Sarah will present for 20 minutes. Yvette will engage her in conversation for another 20, and then we will open it up for the Q&A with the audience. Please to begin, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Krishna. It's wonderful to see you. You remind me that I haven't been there for 8 years in person. So thanks for the opportunity to present my work and to talk about what I'm thinking about really quite recently. And my warmest thanks to Yvette, whose writing and person I much admire, for agreeing to be in conversation with me. Since the invitation is to a reading, I've written a short piece for the occasion, which draws on the academic research I'm doing, but is written in a narrative style, somewhat, in short cameos, along with some images I'd like to show you as I speak to those cameos. I suppose the most forwardly academic part of the short talk is cameo 1, where I talk about the 2 terms that inform my title. So hydrocolonialism is a term developed by my colleague, and indeed Yvette's colleague, Isabella Hofmeyr, and one which has gained wide purchase now in many parts of the world. It offers a way of thinking about water and the hydrological cycle as connected to colonial and imperial histories, as well as power relations of many kinds. As she explains in her book, Hydrocolonialism references Achille Mbembe's influential essay, Provisional Notes on the Post-Colony, extending it in the process by referring to, amongst others, colonization by way of water, colonization of water, a colony on water, colonization through water, for example, through the flooding of occupied land, and colonization of the idea of water. And one of the examples she gives of that is establishing water as a secular resource. Later in my talk, I'll come to the rationalization of rainwater, a term that Judy Livingston, who writes about Botswana, uses. And she considers that to some extent a colonization of the rich sort of metaphysical traditions of thinking with water and indeed rain in this Africa South region. So she makes the case that in post-colonial contexts where land has been overdetermined and the sea over-erased, such revitalizing methods become especially pertinent. And I've seen Isabel Hofmeyr, contested in many a seminar room, since land, of course, has been so crucial in the African South as elsewhere. And she, keeps on saying that, we've done so much work on this. It's viable and interesting to think about the question of water. And I think that her work has shown that in ways that have been generative in our region and elsewhere in the world. The one other thing that she says before I want to move on is that we might, in fact, think about literary interventions. So, for example, in relation to hydrological regions or generic structures, as being like African rainmakers who intercede in the hydrological cycle via their ancestors. And I really like this analogy between the ancestral and the literary text in this case, intervening in our understanding of the water cycle and its narrative possibilities. And I hope that Yvette will come back to rainmaking. There's certainly plenty to say about that further on. I want to point out in this first cameo that hydrocolonialism was developed very much out of an Indian Ocean Studies context. And I can't help pointing out that I work on a corridor, as I was saying to Yvette earlier, where Indian Ocean Humanities Studies, Indian Ocean in Africa Studies has flourished, the same corridor as Isabel Hofmeyr and Sheila Mbembe, and trying to think with and across their work has been formative in the wiser context. So many of us have started to transfer hydrocolonialism and its insights inland, particularly to rivers and to other inland water formations. And this work is both indebted to and puts pressure on Melody Dew's analyses, specifically her arguments about milieu-specific analysis, which calls attention to differences between perceptual environments and how we think within and through them as embodied observers. So she wonders what happens to media theory when it's submerged, for example. And I'll be talking a little bit about what happens, broadly speaking, I suppose, to media, including the literary, for example, in very arid regions, very dry regions, but also regions, and I will take this largely as given, like the African South, which are veering between extreme drought and extreme flooding at the moment, as in many other places of the world. So one of the readings that I asked you to read, depending on your interest, was thinking about reading for water in these terrains and mapping out that as a method to some extent. But let me say that out of these terrains that I've described so far, I've been trying to build work on pluviality, which is the other term in my title today, as a material specificity within the hydrological cycle, but also as an interpretive method. And just as Hofmeyr references rainmakers in passing, so Melody Dew comments on falling water, and that's going to be important to some of the things I want to say today. What is the quality of falling water? She thinks that theorizing scale through falling water, with all its disorienting estrangements compared to the stillness and I suppose to some extent, the predictability of a reflective lake or a dam, somewhat like a mirror, brings us to a crossing of scales that fundamentally depend on humility, precisely because of the multiplicities of that falling water. So I think that you can see why I started to think that pluviality might be an interesting terrain to explore and why there might be more to say there. I did invent the term pluviality from the word pluvial that I found in a dictionary, which comes from the earth sciences. But as you'll see, very shortly, I wanted to denote a material and imaginative world, or some kind of intensification of place and space and time, related then to precipitation, rain, falling waters. And the more that I read and reread, actually, existing Southern African literatures and arts, I found this to be a specific mode of metaphysical and narrative awareness. And I suppose it's no accident, as I was saying to Yvette earlier, that in these fairly dry contexts are now subject also to flooding. Of course, there'd be this particular kind of awareness around rain with some metaphysical depth. So the pluvial is very closely related, of course, to the fluvial. which refers to riverine systems. And so while I'm thinking about falling waters, I'm thinking about flooding rivers as well. And then the second notion I bring to the table today for your critique and consideration is pluvial time. And what that does is draw from climatology a focus on the intervals of time that occur between falling rain events. And that enables us to think about the pluviality as a condition, as an event, not just a materiality, perhaps, or a materiality imbued with conditional event. But I also become more and more interested in it as some kind of inner or ontological time, even as psychic time associated with pluvial modes of thought in African expressive cultures. And I begin to open, and that's what I'll talk to you about in the cameos to come up, the terrain of African feminist pluvialities. And I have something to say at the end tentatively about queer pluvialities in the course of the work that I'm developing. So I want to talk very, very briefly with 3 women African writers from the region. And then I want to draw on a work of poetic scholarship that I think has something to say about pluviality. And I begin with the figure of Bessie Head. Okay, my screen is stuck. I need to move to the next one. Anil, can you help? I am. I'm just going to start talking and I'll ask someone to help me move to the next screen. So it's almost impossible not to begin with the figure in the writing of Bessie Head, who, following devastating experiences growing up as a young mixed race woman in South Africa, really sort of shunted around and disowned via circumstances during the apartheid years, battling with mental anguish, all the while taking jobs as a teacher and a journalist. She moved in 1964 to Bechuanaland on the eve of an independent Botswana and lived as a stateless refugee until the 1970s. She ended up in a village called Sarowe on the eastern edge of the Kalahari Desert. So she worked very much as a writer and a farmer in a village cooperative, and she had despaired about being a writer in a situation of legalized racial segregation, feeling both her personal stability as well as her sense of community to be compromised and cut off. And in Botswana, and specifically in Sarowe, she was able to write, and she wrote widely and intricately and with great attention to rain worlds in a context of drought and aridity. So she lived a very harsh life in spare conditions. But this novel, and this is in fact taken from, you will be surprised to note, the very first exhibition of Black South African artists held in Cape Town in 2022. And they titled that exhibition When Rain Clouds Gather. This was the very first cover of the book, which one sees when one walks into the exhibition. So I, she works very carefully with psychic and metaphoric registers of what I want to call pluviality, as much as with material concerns in relation to village cooperatives and farming. One of her characters in this first book says, "You may see no rivers on the ground, but we keep the rivers inside of us," adding, "Sometimes we see the rain clouds gather, even though not a cloud appears in the sky." And this is really a meditation on living with drought in an already arid land. And again, my colleague Isabel Hofmeyr has talked about Head as a drought-resistant writer, resituating the key media of anti-colonial nationalism and experimenting, as she puts it, with drier forms of literature than the imported British novel ever allowed, depending as it was on reflective surfaces of water. But I want to extend this observation to note the varied and very precise modes of scarce falling water and its pluvial temporalities and ontologies that she offers us in a kind of absorbed, attentive listening, typical of her own writing. In her 1981 book, she writes of rain that never arrives. She writes of leaden downpours enlivening a breathing earth, of rain during drought intervals that falls sparsely, unpredictably, fiercely, and violently. And so really, I think she tries to make rain discernible and meaningful as a set of nodes that enter culture as ontological entities, very sharply linked, as Michael Snegers reminded us, to memory and history, and especially to histories of colonialism, which is why pluviality fits into and extends beyond hydrocolonialism, where local communities were relocated to areas across the African South, much too small for subsistence farming and poor access to permanent water resources. And so their dependence on rain obviously increased significantly, and with that, their ability to read it. Tim Ingold has talked about these as forms of environmental knowing, but I want to develop them specifically out of this region in a place-based analysis as pluvial time. So Head described her life as a life shattered into little bits, but it was in Saroe that somehow those bits started to grow together. And this kind of wovenness, as she researched and described the lives of people who lived around her in those drought conditions, watching falling waters across the horizon and precise pluvial formations, that I think she brings to us a new layering that we can work with within what we used to call sort of post-colonial analysis, but now in a hydrocolonial and pluvial way. I want to turn in the next cameo to Yvonne Vera, and specifically her 1996 text, Butterfly Burning, which is set in Makakoba Township in Bulawayo, along its river, the Umguza, in the late colonial period of southern Rhodesia during the years 1946 to 1950. And I'm very, very grateful to my colleague at WISER, Confidence Joseph, for her readings of this novel, which I build on, but I take in a different pluvial direction. So Makakoba is dry and dusty. This is a black location, Vera writes, just dots of living across a stretching flat land, where trees somehow grow despite the lack of pliable soil and absent drops of edible rain. And along the edges of Sidojiwe E2, the longest street in the township, children play under the skeleton of a broken old umbrella and pretend that it's pouring with rain. I see time passing very quickly, so I simply want to say this. Pepe Laffy, the main character in Vera's work, has a burning longing. She could not stop the longing, even though she heard the water lapping at the edges against the rim, as though she was some kind of river, and there were things like flooding which could take place inside her own body. It was full desire, because she liked the lapping at the rim and the liquid falling down her arms, falling down her knees. And this is a scene that will be repeated in the novel during a self-abortion, which she performs in order to be able to take up her appointments as the first Black nurse in Bulawayo's colonial hospital. She wanted to be something with an outline in the world, and this flooding is born of both desire and despair. For Pepe Laffy, she asks, how is courage to be measured without something as soft as the surface of a lake, a reflection? And that takes us straight back to that question I was asking earlier. Without the sight of reflection, how can we think about these pluvial modes? And in the very end of her book, she dies by self-immolation, giving up in a sort of feminist tragedy on her life as somebody with an outline. But in fact, as Vera writes, she dies inside her own storm. And my colleague, Confidence Joseph, has read that as an inhabitation of the hydrological cycle itself, so that Pepe Laffy dies in the mode of a mythological water spirit motif, evaporating from the arid land of Makakoba, condensing in the sky, and coming back as rain that fills water bodies such as the Umguza River. Okay, I see the time is passing more quickly than I had anticipated, so I move to the third cameo very quickly. But you can see that these African feminist pluvialities emerge from such novels. And I move next only synoptically to catastrophic pluvialities in Namwali Serpil's The Old Drift, which was published in 2019, set in 2023 with an Afrofuturist tilt. Many of you have read my analysis on this novel, so I'm not going to go very far, but I'm going to say that this is a novel across which it increasingly pours with rain, encompassing mosquitoes, its colonial histories of the river, its inspirited waters, and it is a novel not so much of Zambia, but of the Zambezi River Basin. there are many, many moves that it makes, but it does center harm to resettled communities. This was one of the worst dam resettlement disasters in the region. And I know that Yvette's been working on that in a course that she's giving in New York, and I hope she'll talk about that. But only to say that this is an extraordinary multi-generational and matrilineal novel framed by the falls and the dam, Kariba Dam, Victoria Falls, replete with feminist pluvialities, which she produces, female forms of becoming in cyclonic and torrential rains, falling waters and drifts that have silted over, and so on. Complete refusal of the linearity of settler time, whether it's the story of the river or it's the story of the region. So I'll take some guidance now from Krista. The last cameo, which is a couple of paragraphs, was the work of Hugo Canham, who's written an extraordinary book, perhaps the most brilliant book to come out of Southern Africa recently. And the opening scene is one of pluviality, but I'm happy to come back to that in the discussion. Krishna, what would you like me to do?
Oh, please continue. It's okay.
Okay, thank you.
We can stretch our time.
Thank you. This book was published in 2023, a work of poetic scholarship, I would call it, rather than a novel. And the preface begins with an intimate and painful scene of pouring rain, an overflowing river, a broken road ridge, deep rivulets of mud, inland from the shoreline of South Africa's eastern Cape Coast, once designated a black reserve, ironically termed a homeland, and his mother falling and slipping in a liquefying pluvial milieu. This is the preface to the book. On this occasion, the two of us were marooned in a flooding valley. At her insistence, I stopped the car we were traveling in. She was worried that the wheels of the motor vehicle would plunge into the river that had burst its banks. She climbed out of the vehicle, and after a few steps in the thick mud, she slipped and fell, landing on her back. The falling rain washed the mud from her face as she lay looking into the weeping sky. Her wet hair clung to her forehead, a forehead whose design inspired my own. Beside myself with fear, I extricated her from the mud. So his mother's body freezes, a sign her son has come to read as PTSD. And may I add here that Bessie Head died of hepatitis in her 40s. Yvonne Vera died of HIV-related illness at the age of 40. His mother, who is centered in this book, his mother's life is centered in this book. PTSD at the beginning of panic attacks brought on by the ongoing presence of extraordinary violence in her life in a rural reserve. And really lastly, and this is my closing paragraph for now, Canham orientates himself in a temporality that rubs insistently against what he calls colonial time and is a queerly African mode constituted, he says, by failing at being a self-contained and actualized modern subject. It is to be in relation to multiple others, recall the multiplicity of heads falling rains, to eschew the linearity of settler time, and to refuse social formations that are made for man with a capital M. As he reads the winds, the waters, and the rock faces of the shipwrecked shoreline of the coast, considering the encounter of his ancestors in that place, and listening for the traces of lost archives he draws to the present, his work also, I suggest, points to the possibility of queer African pluvialities, in which deepening downpours untether a modernist or settled temporality. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Yvette, would you like to engage Sarah?
Very much, thank you. I just want to thank you, Krishna, for this chance, this invitation, and to Tom and Justin, who are doing all that work in the background, but especially to Sarah, to just for the delight of being in conversation with you once again. You know, one reads someone's work, and then a happy circumstance, you meet that person, and there is a continuity between the work, the politics, and the person you meet. It's a joy to always be in conversation with you. Of course, I listened to you speak, and every question that I thought I had formulated is just blown out of the water, and I want to run in all directions, but I'm going to be more disciplined than that. So as I understand it, pluviality and rain are not the same, in the sense that you're offering pluviality as a reading method, right, at a meta level. And if I'm understanding correctly, pluviality then invokes the conditions in which rain happens, in which it falls or does not fall in the novels you addressed today, or how it falls and the consequences for all living creatures and the world itself. As an aside, and when you were talking about falling water, I suddenly remembered Mosi Oatunye, or Victoria Falls, and the Batoka Gorge. The water that may not, and the water that may not fall if that hydroelectric project goes ahead. Now, one question, just one of many, comes to mind, and it's a very basic question. Is pluviality predicated upon the spectre of a norm? That is, a time of balanced cycles, an uninterrupted nitrogen cycle, if you like, a pre-industrial, a pre-colonial idyll. And could you say a little bit more how the writers you are discussing today, and maybe even in your own work, how you navigate this spectre?
I mean, I think we can take it, Yvette, that there's no such thing as a norm. There's a particularly interesting set of temporalities associated with pluviality in these regions because of what I've come to learn about drought intervals. You will remember that Cape Town was the first zero water city, the first climate change city, and what I've understood subsequently is those drought intervals are getting shorter. So it's this question of the drought interval that I think is fascinating. I wouldn't say that in any of the writers I've talked about, there is an undisputed or undiluted return to something we could call the pre-colonial, but there certainly is an extraordinary interest in it. But I think that, this is where, and I don't know if you want to ask me later about this, but this is where I think that rainmaking is fascinating because it both maps onto the pre-colonial and doesn't. But I think both are interested in two things. One is sort of seasonal time, which is somewhat different from industrial time. And as you know, there's a new kind of interest in that. And I think that works together very, very interestingly and timeously with decolonial imperatives. And in fact, one feeds the other. But I think there's also something about, rather than the pre-colonial, I think what's emerging with pluviality, and indeed, of course, with decoloniality, is the sense of the ongoing present. The ongoing present in Black people's lives in the first instance, the ongoing presence of the lives of the earth that are not categorized into past, present, and future. But we're learning to read them, I think, in this vein of temporality that, again, drawing from Hugo Kuijkenen's book, is untethered. And I find that very suggestive. That really so much of the scholarship I'm reading now is invested in teaching ourselves to think less and less with past, present, and future, but something about a past that is ongoing in the present. I think there's a wide investment in that, and that then would be the case for trying to do the work that I'm doing in relation to pluviality. And so reading Bessie Head in 1968 or 1981, for example, is telling us all sorts of things that we might not have attended to as we think about climate change now. And so it's, as it always is with the kind of scholarship that I think we all do, that the past has purchase on the present in even more ways than we can precisely imagine, and that's true of material worlds as well as metaphysical worlds. So these are the kinds of things that I'm thinking. Your question's such a good one that I'm having to think with it, and you should come back at me. I wonder if it's just, perhaps I could just say that, rather than a norm, we could talk about the unsettled terrain that moves across time and with time. So perhaps that's something we could talk about.
I'm busting to do that. And I really want to talk about rainmaking and knowledge. And I think that you made something far more complex and amazing of my question. So thank you. So what I do want to do is actually move on to this. You mentioned, if I could just stick to this, you referenced materiality and the material, and I want you could just expand a little before we get to other delicious subjects. About that interplay between materiality and the material in your theorization, because I think that you're doing something from a global south, a real southerly viewpoint. And I feel, and I haven't quite fully grasped yet, and I'm wondering if you could help us, that you're orienting us toward the consequences of a distinction from that global south point of view, distinction between material as matter that can be worked or transformed, and the non-material that resides, within it, around it, and in concert with it. I was so reminded, your reading of the Serpal, and then I teach that novel inspired by you and your essay. And in a course that follows the Zambezi from source to delta through countries, so it follows it geographically, socially, historically, politically, all these just I think wonderful ways. I don't know what the students think. I think they enjoy it. But one of the texts we read is the Reynolds Cousins ethnography of Tonga communities that were displaced for the building of the Kariba system, the dam and the lake. And the Chitonga thought of the Zambezi as life-giving. It was their home. And it was seen by the engineers as potential of a different kind of power from the spiritual power of the Nyami Nyami. And at first, it seems like there's a clear distinction. The river, or the water in the river, is material to be converted, or a medium, right? And then yet the water as a river is non-material. But I think that you're also doing something much more complicated, because neither category is stable, right? And the material, so in the sense, are you arguing that materiality as abstract condition is always already a medium of the immaterial? And how is this different in your global South reading from say what might seem to be something that McLuhan was pointing to, something that even Marx was pointing to? So I wonder if you could lead us through this, please.
Yes, of course. I mean, I think the place I would go to is media theory, which I signaled at the beginning. And if you look at the distinctions made, for example, in the Chicago School between material and materiality, it's got a nice, there's a nice fluidity to that distinction that I think might be useful for our discussion. And so indeed, as you say, the material world is the matter from which a thing is or can be made. Materiality becomes even more obscure, Yvette, that which constitutes the matter of anything, something.
Even the river, electricity, even electricity, right? I keep quiet, sorry.
But then when you look at the way in which materiality is thought about in that first layer of media studies, it means that there's something in it that can be worked up or elaborated. There's something that can be worked up or elaborated. And there's also something about the physical matter which assumes potential from its association with non-physical matter. And that non-physical matter could be the ontological, the psychic, questions of selfhood. And it's, and I think it's this multivalence of the material, as they point us to, that would be one starting point for thinking about what I'm trying to do by inventing a term that is, as you say, not just rain, it's a condition, it's an event. It might even be a form of selfhood or subjectivity. And it might have a psychic life, in particular regions and particular cultural contexts and so on. So I think there's that. But then where I'm seeing my work is precisely through the milieu-specific analysis that environmental humanities people start building onto that. Okay, well, what about submergence? And that is quite a life-giving articulation, because we thought we'd reached the end of technology. We are so technological. But she said, well, what happens if you put cell phones and computers underwater in another medium? And of course, the environment of the undersea orients them differently and so on. So that's one move. And the other move is Isabel Hofmeyr's move, reading Melody Jew, and insisting, I think, as we all do in our work, on a Southern perspective by saying, well, in the first instance, what are the media of anti-colonialism? You know, and if one media of anti-colonialism has been land, well, another one is drought. And in the landed media of anti-colonialism, as it's always been read, nobody's ever pointed out the role of reflective water. But in a drought-resistant terrain, all you really have is falling rain. You do not have bodies of reflective water. And so that's the architecture of where I'm going with this. So out of media theory, as we once thought about it, what is material, what is materiality, we start to build on those multiplicities of the political and of region, you know. And that's what we try to do. And we try to say there are a whole lot of intellectual resources on our corridor in Johannesburg that are, you know, working from this terrain, and to put those to work, to critique media theory and to come up with concepts that you might be able to use in New York or Bombay. You know, so that's the thing. And then I think that takes us nicely to rainmaking, because one is getting away from getting into another terrain. Yeah.
Well, again, you know, you've been speaking, and I want to come back. You know, I think about this reflective surface. There's a way in which Kariba Dam and the lake reflects, for the engineers, for the colonial officials, it reflects their power, but it doesn't. Yeah. They do not look upon it. They do not look and see themselves in it. Right? It's not yet the. It's not narcissistic in you know the traditional way, but there is a different kind of reflection happening then, and I only think about that now because of how you're speaking, and that how that Bessie Head's ability to reflect is actually when she is forced into this sense of separation from what she knows, and she has to, as a teacher, she realizes that being a teacher teaches her how to relate to the people, how to relate to the world, to the ecosystem in which she lives. But and I can only think this now because of what you're talking about, reflective surfaces and how expansive the potential is. But I just want to come back to this question that you've also been talking about, and that is knowledge and knowledge over time, and then to move toward the rainmaker through the analogy that Isabel Hofmeyr is setting up, and that you also draw upon. So I have this question about analogy, memory, and knowledge. And I'm to begin with a comment. Again, you talk about rain, and when rain is actually disastrous, flooding. I remember a Wiser podcast on unsettlement, and you remarked that clearance of land to make these unsettlement camps for refugees produces these vulnerable landscapes for people who are already vulnerable. So you talked about the way that rain becomes flood with all these ensuing miseries because the land has been stripped, there's no vegetation to hold and absorb the water, and the kind of infrastructure for that number of people just doesn't exist. Now, in the Southern African context, right, that you and Isabel Hofmeyr are drawing upon, I think that you're theorizing it in a specifically global southerly way. And again, I'm reminded of those displaced Tonga, the consequences of not being able to translate in the immediate their environmental knowledge. There's this 1959 case that Reynolds and Cousin give us, And it's a group of Tonga women who are very hungry. They've been placed in this barren place. They know that at a certain time of year, a particular kind of fruit is there, and they know also that they're allowed to pick that fruit at that time of year. They don't see it, but then they see a tree that has fruit that looks like. They go and they pick that fruit, and the consequences are dire. They're deadly. 59 women and children die of poisoning. So I've got that there about knowledge and this attempt to apply a knowledge and not being able to. And then that's how I want to get to your invocation via Isabel Hofmeyr of the ritual African specialist rainmaker. It's a circuitous route, forgive me. Perhaps it's the figure, right, of the rainmaker. So for Hofmeyr and for you, the figure, if I'm reading correctly, is analogous to a revitalizing method of literary analysis, right? That attends for Hofmeyr to the hydrological, Hofmeyr via Mbembe, and the pluvial for you. Now, in direct relation to this is that my sense is that the rainmaker not only makes rain, but also is the diagnostician. To use a word you also referred to before, a pluviometer, right? He's the or she is the one that has the knowledge gathered over time, understands cyclicality, its disruptions. And I wonder, how far do you want to take this analogy of the one who knows, and then your reading practices that you and Isabel Hofmeyr are offering, and this where the disappearances of knowledges? And I guess are you and Isabel offering yourselves as the rainmakers, or are the authors that you read the rainmakers? Are you the diagnosticians? Is pluviality a diagnostic tool?
Thank you, Yvette. Can I say, first of all, that I think, just returning for a moment to The Old Drift, this extraordinarily magisterial novel, I think one of the most exciting to come out of Southern Africa in the last many years. I think Krishna and everyone else on this call, if they haven't read it, would enjoy it hugely. I think that what's fascinating in that novel, in terms of your comments, is, precisely Kariba Dam as the reflective source of water is the site that is quite relentlessly undone across the novel, and it's indeed the work of drifting and of drift that speaks not only to the Tsonga, is not only the terrain of the river in which the Nyami Nyami is seen to arise, is not only the refusal of singular origins and anything linear. It returns us once again to the past in the present, drifting as an etymological water formation, but also in this more metaphorical way. And so it's precisely that river drift that the Tsonga were working with, living in relation to, fishing alongside, and of course drifting water is not reflective water. It's eddying, it's leaking, it's flooding, and it's falling, so I think that, even that kind of etymology only expands the more you think with this novel, and the degree to which he's embedded in it. Drifting as a critical practice rather than the reflective bodies of water, and that takes one to a different novel form. And indeed the characters, of course, drift through this novel and eddy and leak and come to dead ends and all of that. So there's that, and you also invoked what I think works across the terrain we're discussing, which are mud lives. So Bessie had described her living as mud living because it was poor living, candlelit writing with a piece of paper and pen balanced on her knees, drought-ridden, trying to plant, trying to write, trying to gather the bits of herself together. She described it as a mud life, not only as a life shattered. And those refugee camps, which atmospheric rivers are raining on and are turning to mud, are also mud lives in a way. And so one can work with this, with mud and mud living, I think, in really interesting ways too. In terms of rainmaking, so I think what's interesting about rainmaking, and I want to leave as a small aside, the fact that either myself or Isabel would be rainmakers, that would be too much to claim.
Yeah, but, sorry, I couldn't resist.
but I think rainmaking speaks to everything we've discussed so far, and I think that's why it's compelling people. And when I do talk about this work, people often turn to this. And I want to draw something from Julie Livingston, who's the only scholar who's really written a book on rain. Well, in our terrain, there's very little in the humanities on rain, actually, which is partly why I wanted to do this work. But she's written about Botswana, and she talks about rainmaking as an animated ecology in which the past is in the present, because it's the work of the ancestral. In other words, so the person who can bring rain or bring back rain is the ancestral, imaginary or figure, depending on one's belief system. And so the next thing one can note then about the figure of the rainmaker, of course, is that this supersedes the human, which I think is of interest to us when we think about the more than human, because water and rain is held by the ancestors. And this is quite the opposite, and she points this out in her book, which is called Self-Devouring Growth, quite the opposite of the developmental state, which is so functioned and beset African countries, in which nature, or what we used to call nature and we now call the earth, is treated as an object for growth and excessive consumption. And, so much so that it's becoming self-devouring. And it's certainly becoming self-devouring in Botswana, where water is disappearing at this point, and drought is deepening, as you might imagine. And so one gets this kind of supplanting of rainmaking by these hydraulic technologies. That's modernity, that's the developmental state, that's the domestication of nature. But those technologies can't work any longer to redistribute water, and Livingston does point this out when there's no rain to redistribute. So in other words, pluviality comes into play again, but like the Melody Dew sort of limits of technology. So does the lack of rain, because there's nothing to pipe and distribute. And so it's at that point that one meets this rationalization of rainwater into public health systems or government speak and so on, that rainmaking comes back into play as something that was to do with the longing for rain. It was to do with the, respecting some kind of seasonal mode of thinking and work and operation, rather than sort of excessive consumption, which works all year round. And indeed, in 2015, the government asked people to pray for rain. There are all kinds of contemporary rainmaking that's going on. But the last thing that I want to say is that those rainmakers sought a particular kind of rain. It was soft rain, and it was extended rain. It was not destructive flooding. And what we're seeing in southern and South Africa now is, when 2 years worth of rain is just dumped in 24 hours, kills a lot of people and causes terrible destruction. This is happening in KZN. It's happening in Botswana. There's no rain, and then there's complete flooding. The dams are empty, a flood that's very destructive, back to drought. And so the texture of rainmaking and what earlier rainmakers asked for, I think, is interesting, compared to what some would say is the ancestral punishment for excessive industrialization and consumption these days by destructive flooding and catastrophic fluvialities. So I think it's in all of those ways, and in any of those ways one wants to take it, that this language of rainmaking suddenly seems important to revisit for trying to understand something that's much more planetary, as we know, as we feel in an embodied way. Yeah.
I'm reminded of Dubai, just,
yes.
And that cloud seeding that produces, this unnatural. And I just have a quick last question, and that is the political dimensions of the work that is really driven by you, by Isabel Hofmeyr, by Sean Lavery, by Sheila Mbembe, and all these others in the Oceanic Humanities in the Global South Project. all of which pass through or live at Wiser. And I don't think that the regional specificity should be overlooked. So how does reading from an African South shape your reshaping of readerly method? And I'm wondering what the potentials and the consequences, I stop. That's my final question for you.
Sure. I think two things for the sake of a fairly synoptic answer. The one, of course, is to embed this work substantively and have it haunted by, or to hold the past in the present, of course, by specifically Southern slave geographies in the Indian Ocean. And these elongated histories. And of course, you've written about this in your extraordinary work. You're one of the people who has really driven this long middle passage, our understanding of this long middle passage between East Africa and Latin America, which in substance and in materiality and in psychic and political terrains is somewhat different from Atlantic middle passage articulations. And with that, and certainly coming from Sean Lavery's work, of course, is, well, how do we think about something like Morrison's literary archaeologies and maritime archaeologies, including diving, to think about the question, the methodological question of submersion, coming back all the way back to Melody Dew, but politicizing it, historicizing it, and how to recover a slave ship's artifacts from a hostile and particular submarine environment. So it's this embodied perspective that I think so many people are asking for in so much of the work that we do, to find the archival silences. So you see Sean Lavery doing that. You see Hugo Kakanam, who's not at Wiser, but is in some of our online discussions, trying to read the wind on the shoreline, to reimagine archives that we otherwise can't know and hear. So it's this drawing together, in his case, actually, of Black studies with what used to be called African studies, but with a plea for Black studies to take more interest, actually, in the specificities of African experiences and Southern African experiences, together with land and water. And I would want to talk to him about the possibility of thinking, through pluvialities and queer pluvialities there. So centering Indian Ocean histories, including histories of slavery, would be the first move. The second move would be around questions of migration. If you happen to be able to see the Limpopo River today, you will see migrants trying to cross those rivers. And there's very interesting work on the weaponization of rivers to stop migration, not only in our area, but elsewhere in the world, which is how these concepts travel. The kind of arsiphinious articulations, which is when a tributary of a river is used to stop human migration. So I think that these ecological border infrastructures that are pluvial and hydrocolonial, Yvette, would be another way of thinking, and politically, which is your question to me, around these contexts, using our rivers to think about both migration and xenophobia at the mode of crossing in Southern Africa. These great rivers like the Zambezi cross 7 or 8 African nations, to the Indian Ocean. And I think that becomes our mode of thinking. And it's a state of unsettlement that these bodies of water help us to articulate. And so, yeah, it is. This is work coming from here that I hope, speaks to sort of multiple elsewheres. I think that's where I would leave it. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a question or two from the audience. Damaris, would you like to speak?
Sure. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for the paper, Dr. Nuttall, and thank you so much for your questioning. Now I'm going to say it right, Dr. Christianse. I hope I
Yes,
said it.
fine.
Okay, thank
Local,
you.
it's local, it's local. I
Yeah.
know who you mean.
But I so appreciated a lot of the questions. In fact, your second question and your last question weighed heavily on thoughts that I was having throughout the lecture. So think as a writer that works with archives, that's thinking a lot about the diaspora, that's thinking a lot about empire, not exclusively American, but also English, and how it's impacted identities that are national, but also identities of belonging like home.
Mm.
A lot of what you spoke about resonated with me. So I want to return back to the second question and kind of have you extend it a little bit. And I was wondering how pluviality stands between or kind of adds a kind of access and extension to the various, sometimes similar traditions of Southern African spiritual technologies, and provides a way for Western academic theorists to begin to think about this pre-existing technology and knowledge as a basis of understanding in post-colonial theory, literary studies. But I think like you asked it so much more tastefully in your second question, but
Yeah, so I think I'd like Yvette to come in on this. Let me say two things only. I mean, the one would be development in the reading for water work, which I included in the readings around this articulation of multi-spirited waters, and around this articulation that many ancestral homelands are in fact underwater and have been under-researched, and that I would even associate the waters of a river in African spiritual traditions very much with healing. And so I think that all of those vectors, the kind of multi-spiritedness of our analyses, the submergence not only in the ocean but in the river, there's much less work on that. And there is some research that I could tell you about into shamanic ritual traditions, which incorporate in them a sense of breathlessness, as if one were underwater, and in this case, under river. And that from that, certain kind of spiritual powers accrue. So I would say that, I mean, I'd love Yvette to add to this, but I would say what you're calling spiritual technologies have been underread and have not been drawn properly into these analyses, but that we can work with this idea of the multi-spiritedness of any body of water. And I don't know if you remember, but right at the beginning, I did suggest that that we have to get away from the secularization of water and move to the non-secular. And I think that that's when these traditions come in. If you go to the township of Soweto outside Johannesburg, there are a lot of water deities and Mamawati figures that colleagues are writing about in these otherwise dry terrain. So I think this is a very fertile, very, very fertile, along with rainmaking, a very fertile way to go in our region specifically. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add to what Sarah was saying, is that I just want to say that home, I think itself is much more fluid than we think. And but it needs anchorage, and it is in the end within the person who has some home. I do think that attending to the spiritual, is important. My anxiety is that it would become fetishized, and that it would come to stand for everything in a way that dislocates it from its contemporaneity, and also the way that it adjusts. I'm Yeah. So, Sarah, you mentioned, crossing the Limpopo. I remember going up to Mapangubwe, where it's the confluence, right, of the Shweshwe and the Limpopo. And these vast rivers were absolutely dry. They were dry. And now, yes, they were dry seasons, but never like this. And people were just walking across. Of course, there are dangers up around there because there are wild animal reserves up there. And I thought also, like, in the rainy season, when you have to make those crossings and there is water, I was thinking of the militia who facilitates the crossing, right? Who's what you would call the smuggler, right? Demaria, am I pronouncing Damaris? I beg your pardon, Damaris, yes. And I'm wondering, for Sarah, if there is some confluence of the militia and the rainmaker, if there is something there, the one who has this knowledge about how to make these crossings and who has to understand cyclicality, and then the rainmaker who has to have a particular longer term knowledge and who is tied up very much with the sense of the spiritual, being able to invoke the ancestors who become spiritual. And ancestrality is not just pastness, right? And it's not just the grandmother who died yesterday. Ancestrality is deep time. So I think that is the other thing that I feel that the reading from the global southerly perspective restores to the notion of ancestrality, because I think across the Atlantic right now, ancestrality is just coming to stand for any kind of pastness. And ancestor is the ancestors can be pissed off people too, and you don't want to mess with them, right? So I'm gonna keep quiet.
Can I just say, there might be another question I can't see, but can I just say that was one of the moments in a discussion where it just blows open. So thank you for that. I mean, we talked about the diagnostician and the pluviometer, maybe a rain gauge reading, which is a reading for home, where you understand that kind of pattern. But now we've got the militia, the dry crossing. So that was a serendipitous, critical moment. Thank you.
Only because you opened the gate, you opened the door.
Sarah, I don't see other hands up, so I'll take this opportunity to ask a quick question.
Okay.
How do you anticipate pluviality to travel to other literary terrains, or how drifting as a critical practice can apply to regions beyond the global south?
Well, yes, just by being interesting and productive. But people have to make them travel and then subject them to local conditions. And so I suppose one of the things I'm thinking is, the more we talk about the planetary, the more we have to scale down. And I think we're all finding that. And so this intensification of place is very, very important. So I think the key for me would be subjecting drifting or pluviality to more and more precise articulations. There's a wonderful article written by somebody whose work I mentioned earlier, but not in detail, called Michael Snegg, and it's called 11 Namibian Rains. And he disaggregates Namibian rain into 11 forms of rain. And this is the kind of work that we need. So that is read from the Namib region, which of course it moves into the Botswanan region. So I would say, wouldn't it be fascinating to take pluviality and drift into almost any other context outside of this region, but to subject them to a new locality in a way? And I think that the other thing we're starting to see in critical theory is the insistence on place-based reading. That these things should not drift, as it were, above the terrain and the ground on which they stand and the water in relation to which they exist. And so that would be my hope and to some extent my challenge, that they don't travel as conceptual theory to deposit themselves somewhere else without being subjective to their environmental conditions of that place. But I hope they travel. I think that's as I said earlier, putting some of the most extraordinary work to come out of your continent properly in relation to exciting Southern scholarship, which still doesn't even make it onto the syllabi in very many American universities, would be us working for what we could call, I suppose, a global humanities in a way that's really meaningful. And so this kind of conversation is tremendously interesting and hopeful in that regard.
Yes.
I know we need to finish, but I just want to say, Sarah, I do, when I put your work with Isabel's work, when I put Sean's work on the syllabus, the students think differently, and they return to their global north positionality changed. So I just keep quiet there now.
Thank you.
No. This has been an inspiring, very inspiring conversation. But Yvette, if you have a few more final words, we are happy to hear them.
Well, Sarah should have the last word. I just want to say that, Sarah, when I listened to you speak, and then Damaris, you contributed wonderfully, that I think that the way you've read the Serpal and the way you've read the head, Sarah, it exposes the delusion of those narratives of progress of colonial time. That Johannes Fabian critiqued so well. It's that linear narrative and linear rationality, loved by colonial bureaucracy and story makers, right? And I think that actually the truth is that everybody is adrift, and what causes a particular kind of drift, which is the unsettlement, is the unsettling arrival, and which cannot be undone, of the colonial enterprise. And those fluidities of the rivers that move, they're also absolutely attached to resource extraction. So I'm thinking of people who are following those rivers to try and get to the gold mines, try and get to the diamond fields, etc. Yeah, so that's what I have to say. But Sarah, you inspired this thought now.
Can I add a last word, or you want to close?
Please.
No, well, I just want to say that in the conversations I'm in the seminars I'm in the online forums we run, and in reading Yvette and others' work, I'm starting to feel that we're making progress in this deconstruction of the narratives of progress. That I'm starting to read it across so many texts with so many living and vital modes of inquiry and critique, that I think we're making progress with it. And wouldn't it be a good thing that in this age of terrible multi-crisis, we're finally making real progress in critiquing progress? So that's what I'm feeling, and that's what I'd like to finish with, other than thanking you very much for a good session. Thank you.
No, thank you, and we hope to see you both again, virtually or in person.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You.
Wonderful. Thanks.
Thank you so much.